It was over Thanksgiving dinner when my sister found out I had $13 million, and suddenly, my whole family turned on me. They insisted I hand it over to her because, in their words, she needed it more. My name's Elise, I'm 39, and honestly, I just need to speak my truth. You know those families where one child is treated like royalty while the other fades into the background? That's been my reality for most of my life. Things were pretty standard at first. Up until I turned 9, I was the only child. My parents weren't overly affectionate, but they were around. My mom would occasionally help me with schoolwork, and every once in a while, my dad would take me out on his boat at Summit Lake to catch sunfish. We weren't exactly picture perfect, but life felt normal. Then one night changed everything. I remember waking up to see my Aunt Dana at my bedroom door around 2:30 in the morning. She told me to throw some clothes in a bag. My mom had been rushed to the hospital. My sister Claire was on her way into the world, but something was clearly wrong. She wasn't supposed to be born for another 8 weeks. The next few weeks were a blur of ICU visits and whispered conversations behind closed doors. Claire was so tiny, like one of those miniature dolls I used to play with. Except she was surrounded by wires and medical equipment. I wasn't allowed to touch her or even get close. That was the moment I first noticed it, a silent divide starting to grow between me and the rest of the family. When they finally brought Claire home, the house turned into something out of a medical lab. My mom became fanatical about hygiene. There were sanitizing stations in every corner, heavy-duty cleaning products used daily, and the smell of bleach hung in the air like a cloud. Even now, that scent makes my stomach tighten. But the worst part? If I showed even the faintest sign of a cold, I'd be packed off to Grandma Lorraine's or Aunt Dana's place. No questions asked. I mean, it got to the point where if I sneezed twice, I was told to pack a bag. One little cough and I'd be staying at Grandma's. In the beginning, I didn't mind. Grandma Lorraine always had fresh muffins cooling on the counter, and Aunt Dana had shelves full of vintage mystery novels, mostly the Olivia Gray series, which I'd started working through one by one. But kids aren't clueless. After a while, I realized this wasn't some fun getaway. It was exile. I wasn't being treated like part of the family. I was being treated like a walking hazard, like just being near me could somehow put my sister at risk. I tried, really tried, to get their attention in a positive way. I did everything right, straight A's, every report card. Mom barely glanced up from Claire's medical appointment binder. I won first place in the school science fair with a project on wind-powered desalination. Dad's only comment was, "Can you put the display in the garage?" Claire's sensitive to dust from cardboard. I still don't know if that's even a real allergy. But the moment that really stayed with me happened when I was 12. I'd spent months learning to play Bridge Over Troubled Water on the piano for our school's talent show. I know, it's kind of a sentimental choice, but I poured everything into it. The night of the performance, Claire had a low-grade fever, 99.1 degrees, and just like that, no one showed up to watch me. Not one family member in the audience. 2 weeks later, Claire had a 15-minute flute recital. She could barely get through hot cross buns without squeaking on every note. But every single relative, even both sets of grandparents, was there, clapping like she'd just performed at a symphony hall. Claire figured things out pretty quickly. By the time she was 7, her medical issues had mostly faded, but she knew exactly how to work the dynamic to her advantage. Headache? Stay home from school. Tired? Someone else would do her chores. Guess who? Anxious about a quiz? Mom would be on the phone with the principal within the hour, requesting an extension. I started spending more time alone in my room, getting lost in books about art history and antique design. It became my safe place, somewhere I could feel like myself. It's strange how things work out. My bedroom ended up being my safe space, mainly because Claire insisted she was allergic to the vanilla sage room spray I liked, which meant it was the one area she'd avoid. And honestly, when she faked being sick, part of me almost welcomed it. At least then I'd be sent to Grandma Lorraine's, where someone would actually ask how I was doing or take an interest in what I liked. Grandma was the one who sparked my fascination with vintage accessories. She had this amazing stash of old costume jewelry that she let me sort and catalog. I guess, in hindsight, that was the first glimpse of what would become a lifelong passion, but the hardest part wasn't even the obvious favoritism. It was the way they rewrote the story to justify it all. Claire needs more care. She had such a difficult start. Elise has always been so independent. Elise understands that her sister has different needs, but I didn't understand. I was a kid trying to figure out why being healthy somehow meant I deserved less attention, less love. Those years left their mark. That constant sense of being seen as a burden or a problem doesn't vanish overnight. But I will say this, it taught me how to rely on myself. When no one's checking your work or celebrating your wins, you learn to be your own biggest supporter. High school was a mixed bag for most people. Some loved it, others couldn't wait to leave. Me? I saw it as a stepping stone. While Claire was busy building her theater reputation in middle school, I was quietly putting together an exit plan. If there's one thing that motivated me, it was the clear understanding that no one else was going to push me forward. That time I spent organizing Grandma's jewelry, it showed me how valuable structure and attention to detail could be. So in high school, I brought that same mindset into everything I did. My desk at home looked like it belonged in a productivity magazine. Color-coded notes, neatly outlined schedules, every item perfectly arranged. Claire used to make fun of me for it, calling me Rain Man, real classy. But here's the benefit of being overlooked. No one's tracking your missteps or achievements. You get to carve your own path. I joined every club that didn't conflict with my shifts at Porter's Cafe. Shout out to Carla, the owner, for remembering my birthday the year my parents didn't. Debate team? Check. National Honor Society president? Check. Editor-in-chief of the school paper? Also check. Joining the debate team was the moment I really discovered my voice. There's something deeply satisfying about calmly dismantling someone's argument while staying completely composed. It also sharpened my negotiation skills, something I didn't know I'd need later on. I ended up winning the state championship twice. But of course, during both of those competitions, my parents were at Claire's soccer games. She was on the reserve squad and didn't even get field time. Still, they couldn't be in two places at once. Everything shifted junior year. That's when things started to get really interesting. I took the ACT and got a perfect score. Not almost perfect, I mean full marks. A Harmon Chadadick fewer than 1% of test takers pull that off. I stared at the results screen for 20 minutes, convinced it had to be a glitch. I ran home to share the news. I know, it sounds naive, but I really thought this one might matter. Mom was in the kitchen, helping Claire diagram sentences for an English quiz. The exchange went something like this. Me. Mom, look, I got a perfect score on the ACT. Her, that's great, Elise, but can you keep your voice down? Claire needs to focus, she's got a big test tomorrow. Claire chimed in, yeah, some of us actually have to study, Miss Genius. And Mom? She just smiled at Claire and said, it's okay, sweetheart. You just learn in your own special way. I still have the printed copy of those test scores tucked away in a folder. They never made it onto the fridge. Meanwhile, Claire's C+ in English, that one earned a prime spot, framed by a sparkly "We're so proud" magnet. The college process was revealing. I applied to 15 universities without telling anyone, wrote every essay myself, requested all my own recommendation letters, and handled every piece of the financial aid process on my own. My guidance counselor, Mr. Patel, ended up being my real lifeline. Since my parents were too preoccupied to help me with the financial aid forms, I stayed after school most days to fill out the FAFSA with his help. Then, one by one, the acceptance letters started rolling in. Stanford, Columbia, Penn, Northwestern, and each came with a merit scholarship. I kept all the letters locked in a box under my bed, fully aware of what would happen if Claire found out. The whole household would shift gears to soothe her. Something like, but if Elise leaves for Stanford, what about me? Or some equally manipulative line. The day I got the full ride offer from Midwestern University, Claire made the junior varsity cheer squad. Want to guess which achievement got the big family dinner? Spoiler. I had microwave mac and cheese alone in my room while they celebrated at a steakhouse. But the scholarship, that was my golden escape hatch. It covered everything. Tuition, housing, meals, even books. For the first time, I had a real path out of that house, where I was always either ignored or treated like a problem. When the acceptance packet arrived, I walked straight to my usual spot in the town library, a corner window seat on the top floor that overlooked the gardens, and I cried for nearly an hour. Not from sadness. It was the first time in my life I felt real relief. That night over dinner, I told my parents I'd be attending Midwestern in the fall. Their reactions? Mixed. Dad said, "That's pretty far. What if Claire needs you?" Mom added, "I hope you're not expecting any financial help. Cheerleading costs are really adding up." Claire, on cue, burst into tears and said, "Ugh, finally. Can I have your room now? I need a space for my content." That summer, I worked double shifts at Porter's Cafe to build up my savings. Carla, bless her, always made sure I got extra tips and never let me leave without taking home the leftover dessert slices at the end of the night. Carla also taught me something far more valuable than how to balance dishes on a tray, how to spot sincere people in a world full of pretenders. "Kid," she used to say, "in life and in diners, the loudest ones usually have the least to offer." Move-in day at Midwestern University came around, and no surprise, my parents couldn't make it. Claire had a cheerleading competition, again, so it was Aunt Dana who drove me, helped me unpack my boxes, and handed me a plain white envelope with $500 tucked inside. "Your grandma Lorraine wanted you to have this," she said. "She told me to tell you she's proud, so proud." I later found out Grandma had been quietly setting aside a bit of her Social Security check each month to save that money for me. That first night in my dorm, sitting on a twin bed surrounded by unpacked bins and new bedding, I made a quiet vow to myself. I was going to build a life so rich and fulfilling that being ignored would one day seem impossible, not out of spite and not to prove anything to anyone. It was for the little girl who used to be sent away at the first sign of a sneeze. College was a whirlwind of late nights, cafeteria coffee, and blissful freedom. I graduated summa cum laude from Midwestern. Not that my family noticed. By then, they were busy helping Claire switch to her third college in just 2 years. But this is where things took an unexpected direction. I landed an entry-level job at Kingsley and Howard Fine Estates in Detroit, not their real name, for obvious reasons. But if you're familiar with that world, you'd know the type of place I'm talking about. High caliber, private client dealings, lots of generational wealth and discretion. I started in the estate division, cataloging household items for auction after a client passed away. It wasn't exactly thrilling work, documenting endless sets of porcelain, labeling vintage settees, but it paid my rent. Then came a turning point, the estate of Eleanor Whitmore. She was an elderly widow with no surviving family, and she'd left behind what was believed to be an enormous stash of inexpensive costume jewelry, entire rooms filled with it. That's when all those hours I spent with Grandma Lorraine started to pay off. I was sifting through trays of beaded necklaces and old brooches when something unusual caught my eye. It was an Art Deco brooch. Nothing flashy or oversized, but something about it immediately stood out. The weight felt too substantial for costume jewelry, and the clasp was far too intricate to be a replica. I couldn't explain it, but I had a hunch. That day, I skipped lunch and dove into researching antique jewelry marks. After hours, I stayed behind and used the company's access to a few professional gemology databases. The deeper I dug, the more convinced I became. This piece wasn't costume, it was genuine, high-value vintage. But I was still the rookie on staff. No one was going to take my word for it if I simply claimed we had a hidden gem. So, I leaned into what I knew, debate skills. I spent the next 2 weeks using every spare moment to gather proof. During lunch breaks and late evenings, I studied everything I could about Art Deco-era authentication. I even used the last bit of my savings to enroll in an online gemology course. Finally, I worked up the courage to go to my supervisor, Mr. Langston. I came armed with a full presentation, side-by-side images, documented provenance, historic references, everything I could pull together. The conversation went something like this. Me: "Sir, I think we might have something special in the Whitmore estate." Langston, not even glancing up from his tablet. "Elise, those were all labeled as costume pieces." Me: Right, I know, but please look at this maker's mark. It's identical to Cartier's 1924 insignia. He finally looked up. Where did you learn all this? I just said, I did some digging. Long story short, that costume brooch sold for $47,000 at auction. Turns out it was from a limited edition line produced for European collectors in the mid-1920s. And the best part? From that moment forward, Langston actually began to trust me. He started assigning me real responsibilities, authenticating other estate pieces, doing deeper evaluations, giving me room to specialize. That moment changed everything. Suddenly, all those hours I'd spent organizing Grandma Lorraine's jewelry weren't just a hobby. They were the foundation of my career. I went all in. I took every affordable online course I could find. I spent my weekends at estate sales, taking notes and photographing hallmarks. I even started keeping a small leather notebook filled with authentication steps and reference guides. Soon, my apartment looked like a jewelry historian's workspace, walls lined with photocopies of vintage signatures, diagrams of setting styles, and pages torn from appraisal manuals. The auction house began to see real progress. I was identifying high-value pieces that had been completely overlooked by others. I started forming relationships with serious collectors, learning how the market moved, and little by little, my commission checks started to grow. For the first time in my life, I wasn't just getting by. I was actually building savings. Back at Sunday dinners, though, the family remained completely uninterested. And yes, I still showed up, like a fool. Conversations typically went something like this. Mom, Elise is still working at that antique store, right? Me. It's actually a fine art auction house. And yes, I just authenticated a rare Tiffany piece last week. Claire. Oh my gosh, speaking of jewelry, look at this charm bracelet I just got at the mall. It has little hearts and everything. But honestly, by then, it didn't get to me anymore. Because I had finally found something that was entirely mine. Something I didn't have to share or explain. Something I was truly, undeniably good at. And for once, it had nothing to do with being Claire's sister or the family's afterthought. Then came the Rothmere collection. About 2 years into the job, our firm was hired to handle a major estate, an old money family with deep roots and even deeper vaults. The industry was buzzing. I was part of the team assigned to catalog their jewelry holdings. That's when I saw it, a fairly simple-looking Art Nouveau pendant tucked in with a batch of more ordinary pieces. Nothing flashy, but something about it didn't sit right. I spent 3 straight days researching, hardly sleeping. Eventually, I traced it to a French jeweler's private collection believed to have been lost during World War II. When it sold at auction for $238,000, I thought I might be getting a promotion. Mr. Langston called me into his office. But instead of a raise, he said something I didn't expect. Elise, you're wasting your talent here. You should be running your own authentication firm. At first, I laughed it off. Me? Start a business? With what capital? But the idea didn't leave me. It settled quietly in my mind, and slowly, I started taking small freelance jobs on the side, verifying family heirlooms, checking collections for private clients. Word started to spread that I had an exceptional eye. Before long, collectors were reaching out directly. One evening, I was sitting in my small apartment, surrounded by stacks of jewelry reference books and the growing pile of authentication tools I'd collected over time, when it finally hit me. I could actually do this. I could build something entirely on my own. So I did what any rational person would do when inspiration strikes. I took out a hefty loan against my car, emptied my savings, and signed a lease for a tiny office in a part of town most people avoid after dark. Everyone thought I'd lost my mind. Maybe I had. The space was a former storage room above a noodle shop, barely larger than a dorm room. The rent was cheap because it constantly smelled like garlic sauce, and the Wi-Fi only worked if you sat at an awkward angle by the window, but it was mine. And the truth? Those first few months were rough, and by rough I mean terrifying. I'd wake up at 4 a.m. in a cold sweat, mentally tallying how long my funds would last. Loan payments felt like they were tightening around me. My office furniture consisted of a folding table I found at a thrift shop and a desk chair I rescued from a curbside trash pile. Don't worry, I scrubbed it thoroughly. But in the fine jewelry world, it's all about credibility and connections. Thankfully, my time at Kingsley and Howard gave me both. I started small, authenticating pieces for local antique stores. My rates were much lower than the major appraisal firms, but my meticulous reports started building a quiet reputation. Word traveled. 6 months in, everything changed. One of the dealers I had worked with during my auction house days reached out. A client wanted verification on a set of Victorian hair brooches before selling. Turned out it wasn't just a few heirlooms, it was a sprawling collection spanning 3 generations. I poured myself into the project, 2 full weeks, little sleep, cataloging every detail. In the process, I identified 2 rare originals that had been incorrectly labeled as modern reproductions. The client was so impressed by my report that she not only paid my full fee, but also offered me a 10% commission once the pieces sold. That commission? $86,000. It was more money than I'd made in the previous 2 years combined. After that, the phone barely stopped ringing. Word had gotten out. Private collectors started contacting me directly. Estate attorneys asked for valuations on inherited pieces. Even Kingsley and Howard began forwarding work my way. I had a feeling Langston might have been quietly vouching for me behind the scenes. If so, thanks, boss. By my 2nd year in business, I brought on my first hire, Jenny, a newly certified gemologist who reminded me a little too much of myself when I was just starting out. Jenny turned out to be brilliant. Quiet, yes, but often the quiet ones are the most overlooked. She'd been passed over before, but not by me. Now she's my head of authentication, and honestly, she's worth every penny. The business grew faster than I ever imagined. We moved into a real office space downtown, finally said goodbye to the lingering scent of stir-fry, and I started building a team of experts around me. Word spread quickly about our knack for uncovering lost treasures. You wouldn't believe how many valuable historical pieces sit forgotten in attic boxes, dismissed as junk or costume jewelry. For a while, I kept the business completely under wraps from my family. But as things scaled up, the secret became harder to maintain. They still believed I worked at a small antique store. Claire would toss out passive-aggressive comments at family dinners like, "Elise, I was going to donate some old bracelets to the thrift store. Maybe your little shop wants them." Meanwhile, earlier that same day, I had authenticated a Fabergé piece valued at $1.2 million. Me. Sure, I'll take a look. Mom still introduced me as my other daughter. She works with old jewelry or something. And yet, I'd just been quoted in Forbes, thankfully, under my company name, and we had just opened our 3rd office. Strangely, keeping it to myself became part of the fun. A little secret world I carried with me. I'd show up to Sunday dinners in a clearance rack sweater from Target, actually vintage Chanel, and listen to Claire complain about her entry-level marketing job, knowing full well I'd just closed a deal that week worth more than her yearly salary. I even made a game of it. I'd wear genuine Harry Winston earrings to family events just to see if anyone noticed. They never did. Claire once spent 20 minutes bragging about her $200 Michael Kors watch. I was wearing a rare vintage Patek Philippe, worth more than her car. But the real challenge wasn't keeping secrets, it was managing scale. By our 5th year, we had established offices in Detroit, Chicago, and New York. I was flying so often I practically lived in airport lounges. We became known for our discretion. Turns out there's a whole tier of wealthy clients who want their jewelry authenticated quietly, without headlines or attention. And the money in that space? Astounding. Soon, we needed to bring in an entire team of financial consultants to help manage the growth. Still, I kept my personal life simple. I bought a beautiful but unpretentious house in a nice neighborhood. My car? High-end but subtle. No need for flashy statements. The only place I truly allowed myself to splurge was my home office. Top-tier authentication tools, a state-of-the-art security system, and a custom vault that could make a bank blush. It was my sanctuary and the heart of my operation. What's ironic is how my family misunderstood my choices. They assumed I was pinching pennies. Mom would say things like, "It's so sweet of Elise to help out like that. She must be living on instant noodles to afford it." Meanwhile, I had just verified a private collection that brought in a commission larger than their annual mortgage payments. Here's the strange thing about success, especially when people have only ever seen you through a narrow lens. The more you accomplish, the less they're able to comprehend it. Trying to explain it to them felt like describing color to someone who's only known grayscale. They didn't have the frame of reference. At that point, my business was thriving. We'd locked in our place as the Midwest's go-to firm for high-end jewelry authentication. Our reputation in the industry? Rock solid. But every Sunday, I still went back to my parents for dinner playing the part of Elise, the humble antique shop employee. The disconnect was almost absurd. I'd spend mornings on video calls with clients in Zurich or Abu Dhabi, then examine pieces worth 7 figures in the afternoon, only to be back at the family table by 6, dressed carefully in casual clothes, eating overdone roast beef, listening to Claire go on about her newest work win. Usually something like, I delivered a cappuccino to my boss without spilling it. But then there was one Sunday I'll never forget. That weekend, I had just finalized an authentication for a long-lost Cartier piece, locked away in someone's forgotten safe deposit box for 4 decades. Was it just the payout that made it memorable? Not exactly. 7 figures. That was the final valuation. After wrapping up the meeting, I drove straight to my parents' house, still riding the high from the deal. I couldn't stop smiling. As I walked through the door, Mom gave me a once-over and said, "Elise, sweetheart, are you okay? Your clothes are looking a little tired." "Oh, just trying to be frugal," I replied, fully aware I was wearing a $3,000 cashmere sweater, chosen precisely because it looked understated. Claire chimed in with, "Well, maybe if you had a real career instead of fiddling with dusty jewelry." Dad interrupted her, chuckling. "Claire, be kind. Not everyone can be as accomplished as you." I nearly choked on my overcooked roast, biting my tongue to keep from laughing. Around that time, I quietly began sending money to help them. Aunt Dana had mentioned in passing that my parents were struggling to pay off Claire's college loans and medical expenses. At one point, Mom even mentioned they might have to put the house on the market. Despite everything, it was still the house I'd grown up in. I couldn't stand the thought of losing it. So I set up anonymous monthly transfers, $5,000 directly into their account. When they asked, I told them I was scraping together $1,000 a month and living mostly on rice and frozen veggies. They assumed the rest came from Aunt Dana or some distant cousin. Claire, of course, claimed full credit. She said she had inspired the family to rally together. Watching her spend my money was a lesson in patience. While the financial help genuinely made a difference, it also led to some unexpected side effects. My parents began treating me with this odd blend of pity and exaggerated pride. Like I was a noble, self-sacrificing martyr who had given up everything for the sake of the family. Claire's lifestyle, meanwhile, grew more extravagant by the month. She'd show up to dinner with designer bags she claimed were incredible outlet finds. But I know luxury pieces. I can identify an authentic Gucci tote without needing to be close. She started posting photos of luxury vacations and tropical getaways, gushing online about how blessed she was. And honestly, I'm fairly sure a lot of that money came from the same account I was quietly funding. Still, I said nothing. The irony of it all was honestly kind of perfect. Then came the next chapter in the saga. Claire decided she wanted to go back to school for an MBA. Not just anywhere, of course. A private university, top tier only. Nothing less for the family star. Naturally, Mom called me in tears, explaining they simply couldn't afford it. I gently suggested that maybe Claire could consider a state program. They offer excellent business tracks too. Mom responded, "Oh, sweetheart, you don't understand. Your sister needs to keep up a certain image." Then, not missing a beat, "Would it be possible to increase your monthly contribution? Just for a few years?" So I raised it to $7,000 a month. It didn't make much of a dent in my finances, but watching them shower Claire with praise for taking charge of her future while thinking I was barely scraping by to help, it stung. And then came the twist, the very business school Claire was applying to. I had recently been invited there by the dean. to give a guest lecture on luxury goods, authenticity, and sustainable growth. My name was on the university's seminar calendar. My family had no idea. I had to make up an excuse about why I wouldn't be at Sunday dinner that week. And in that moment, I felt like I was living a double life. By day, I was running a multi-million-dollar authentication firm. By night, or more accurately by Sunday evenings, I was Elise, the quiet disappointment who worked at some vague little antique shop. Eventually, it became too much to carry. The weight of the charade was starting to press down harder. Thanksgiving was when everything finally broke. Claire had made several snide comments about my job in front of guests. Mom had once again explained to friends that I had chosen a humble lifestyle. Dad tossed out his usual line about how I really ought to consider finding a proper career. I think deep down, I always knew this facade couldn't last forever. But I never imagined the unraveling would be quite so explosive. It all started about 2 weeks before Thanksgiving. Mom called me in tears, complaining about pain in her lower back. She'd been diagnosed with a herniated disc, and the idea of hosting and cooking for 20 people had her completely overwhelmed. Now, I'd love to say I offered to help purely out of kindness. But honestly, I was just tired of pretending her dry turkey was remotely edible. So I said, "Why don't I take care of the food this year? I can have it catered." Her response, "Oh, sweetheart, we can't afford anything like that." I replied, "Don't worry about it. I've been putting some money aside." She hesitated. "You're not going into debt for this, are you?" I didn't go into details. I just made the arrangements. I reached out to a catering service I regularly use for client events. They're the kind of team that makes food so exquisite you wonder why anyone ever bothers to cook at home. The bill was more than what my parents assumed I earned in 2 months, but I didn't blink. Thanksgiving morning arrived, and I actually felt pretty good. I had brought my laptop along because I needed to monitor an important auction taking place in Hong Kong. A stunning Art Nouveau necklace was up for bidding, and one of my top clients was interested, pending my authentication. The meal was delivered on time, beautifully packaged, every dish plated to perfection. Claire naturally couldn't resist making a comment. "Wait, boxed stuffing? Really, Elise? Mom's is so much better." This from someone who once triggered the smoke alarm trying to heat up frozen waffles. Mom kept apologizing to the guests for not cooking herself, but let's be honest, you could tell everyone was loving the food. Even Claire went quiet after trying the maple-glazed Brussels sprouts. Just for reference, those cost more per serving than what she probably spends on groceries in a week. While everyone settled into dessert, I stepped away for a moment to check in on the auction. The auction was heating up, and I needed to stay alert in case my client secured the winning bid. I set up in my old bedroom, yes, still exactly as it had been when I was 17. Posters on the walls, dusty trophies on the shelf. Meanwhile, Claire's room had been remodeled 3 separate times. That's when things spiraled. I had left my authentication software open, multiple tabs up, showing account summaries, current contracts, and recent sales figures. Claire barged in, as always, without knocking. She needed a phone charger. Some habits never change. Then she caught sight of my laptop screen. Her face lit up, not with curiosity, but with that familiar smirk. Like she'd finally found something to prove how unimpressive I really was. "Well," she said, "let's show everyone what Elise has actually been doing with her time." Before I could stop her, she snatched the laptop and marched back into the dining room. Now imagine this, 20 people gathered around the table, aunts, uncles, cousins, and both my parents, everyone full of gourmet turkey and half-tipsy from wine they assumed came from a bargain bin. It didn't. Claire, grinning like she was about to reveal some deeply embarrassing hobby, held up the screen. "Time to show you all the very important work Elise is doing on Thanksgiving," she said, flipping the laptop around for everyone to see. Then, silence. The kind of stillness where even the ticking of the decorative clock Mom thought was a cheap replica seemed loud. On display, current account balance $12.4 million, pending contract $485,000. Last transaction $1.2 million. Hong Kong auction firm's quarterly report $4.2 million profit. Claire's face went through an emotional spectrum that could have earned her an acting award. Confusion, disbelief, envy, panic, and finally, queasy disbelief. She actually wobbled for a second. She muttered, This can't be right." Mom, puzzled, asked Claire, "What is it?" Claire, voice cracking. Elise is... she's rich." And then chaos. Except for one thing. Mom started to laugh, not a little chuckle. She really laughed. Mom let out a laugh. "Don't be ridiculous. Elise works at that little antique shop." I stood up slowly, smoothing out my understated cashmere sweater, the one that cost more than their monthly mortgage. Me. "Actually, Mom, I run one of the top jewelry authentication firms in the country." Those antique shop comments? I've been evaluating pieces worth millions for years. That little company no one ever asked about, it now has offices in 3 cities. Dad nearly spat out his drink. Aunt Dana dropped her fork. Uncle Rob went into a coughing fit. Mom's laugh stopped cold. Her face shifted from flush to almost purple. She stood so fast her chair clattered to the floor behind her. She shouted, "You've been sitting on millions and let us struggle?" I replied calmly, "Struggle? I send you $7,000 every month." Her voice sharpened. "While sitting on that kind of money, your sister has student debt." And just like that, there it was. Not a single "well done," not a single "we're proud of you." Only resentment that I hadn't given more. Claire began crying, which honestly caught me off guard. She sobbed about how she had a right to know, how I'd betrayed the family. Then my father chimed in, his tone sharp. "How could you be so selfish? We're your parents. We raised you." And that was the moment I snapped. Every year of being ignored, every moment of being dismissed, every time I was treated like the family footnote instead of a daughter, all of it came pouring out. Me. Raised me? You mean sending me to Grandma's every time I had the sniffles? Missing every science fair, every competition, every honor I ever earned? Because Claire might get upset if I got too much attention. You didn't save a dime for my education, but you found money for her private school. And now you're angry that I built a life on my own? The next 5 minutes were nothing short of chaos. Mom was shouting about family responsibility. Dad launched into a rant about ungrateful children. Claire alternated between crying and demanding to know exactly how much money I had. All the while, the catering staff stood awkwardly in the corner, trying to serve dessert while clearly wishing they were anywhere else. I picked up my laptop, grabbed my Hermes handbag, the one Mom once complimented as a very convincing knockoff, and walked straight out. Behind me, I could still hear Mom, her voice rising, already planning how my money should be spent. Something about Claire's MBA and replacing her old car. As I drove home in my understated but rare BMW, limited edition, not flashy, just quietly exceptional, my phone started lighting up like a holiday tree. The family group chat exploded. Claire had already begun airing everything online. She took to Facebook, of course, posting dramatic status updates about hidden family fortunes and selfish siblings who watched their loved ones suffer. The fallout in the days that followed felt like a storm unraveling in slow motion. Except the hurricane was my family, and the emotional debris, that was mine to clean up. Let's begin with the text messages. Within an hour of leaving dinner, I had 47 missed calls and over 200 texts. Mom's messages escalated in classic fashion. 7:42 p.m. How dare you abandon your family like that? 8:15 p.m. Let's sit down and talk this through like adults. 9:03 p.m. Your sister deserves to benefit from your good fortune. 10:30 p.m. I've already contacted a realtor, just looking at options in a nicer neighborhood. 11:45 p.m. Why aren't you responding? This is your mother. Meanwhile, Claire had fully committed to her role as the social media victim. She posted a long-winded rant detailing how her wealthy sister had supposedly hidden her success, while their devoted family struggled in silence. The comment thread, absolutely unhinged. People I hadn't heard from in years, old classmates, distant cousins, vague family connections, suddenly had passionate opinions about my character. But what truly stopped me in my tracks was Claire's follow-up post. She actually wrote, "All those years I spent trying to help Elise build a career, giving her advice, encouraging her to move beyond that little antique shop. Turns out she was wealthy the whole time. The betrayal hurt." I almost flung my phone across the room. Help? The only career advice she ever gave me was suggesting I sell beaded bracelets on Etsy. If you're unfamiliar with the phrase flying monkeys, it refers to when toxic relatives recruit others to guilt trip you on their behalf. Aunt Linda, who I usually see once every few years at best, called to remind me that family is everything. Uncle Tom, who, to this day, probably thinks I'm still in middle school, sent me a long-winded email about the importance of sharing success. Even someone as far removed as my third cousin's wife's sister, I still don't know how she got my number, felt entitled to weigh in with her thoughts on giving back. But the real turning point came Monday morning. I arrived at the office, coffee in hand, ready for a regular day, only to find Mom, Dad, and Claire seated in the reception area. They had told Jenny, my front desk associate, that they were there for a scheduled authentication appointment. Claire sat stiffly, clutching her Michael Kors handbag like it was a prized collector's item, and from there the conversation unfolded exactly how you might imagine. Mom led the charge. "We've talked it over as a family," Mom said. I replied, "Interesting. A family discussion that didn't include the person you're discussing." She ignored me. "We think it's only fair you establish trust funds for everyone." Claire jumped in. "I need at least $2 million to really start fresh and build the kind of life I deserve." Dad followed with, "And your mother and I are ready to retire. We're thinking somewhere warm, maybe a beach house in Florida." Me, "Did you all forget I've been sending you $7,000 a month?" Claire rolled her eyes. "That's barely anything compared to what you have. You owe us." "Owe you? For what exactly? The years of being invisible? The birthdays no one showed up for? The endless comparisons?" Mom waved a hand. "Now don't be so dramatic, Elise. We gave you everything." My response? I gave myself everything, and I'm done. Right there, standing in my own office lobby, I pulled out my phone and canceled the monthly transfers. Mom gasped like I'd just flipped the dinner table. Claire launched into her signature teary act, but when no one reacted, she gave it up quickly. That's when things got ugly. They refused to leave. I had to call building security. Watching a security officer escort my 60-year-old mother out while she shouted about ungrateful children was one of the strangest moments of my life. Jenny quietly asked if I wanted to press charges. "No," I said, but I did have their names added to our office's do not admit list. The harassment didn't stop. New phone numbers, random email aliases, even fake client inquiries sent through our company's support team. I finally had to send a formal legal notice warning of harassment consequences. Then Mom played her final card. She called Grandma Lorraine. But here's the thing about Grandma Lorraine, she's sharper than the rest of them combined. Her response? "Well, good for Elise. It's about time someone in this family made it on their own terms." Mom didn't speak to her for 2 months after that. It's been half a year since that Thanksgiving. I've since moved into a new home with better security and, more importantly, peace of mind. All my numbers have been changed. And the business, it's thriving more than ever. Ironically, all the family drama ended up drawing in a handful of high-profile clients, people who appreciated my ability to stay private under pressure. They respected the boundaries I held, especially once they heard the full story. As for Claire, she's still posting vague jabs online, long captions about toxic wealth and being betrayed by those closest to you. Last I heard, she's trying to start her own jewelry authentication company. Best of luck with that. Mom and Dad finally stopped reaching out after my attorney sent them a formal notice, explaining in clear legal language how continued harassment could impact their lives. Since then, they've been telling people they never wanted my money anyway, and that they're praying I find my way back. But the best part? For the first time ever, I feel completely free. No more Sunday dinners laced with subtle jabs. No more shrinking myself to keep others comfortable. No more quietly footing the bill for the Claire show. My therapist says I'm finally learning to set real, healthy boundaries. I think I'm just finally living, honestly.